What did you just call her?
Mommy.
At 12:07 in the morning, the most feared man in Seoul walked into his own house and heard something he had not heard there in years. Laughter. Not the polite laughter of adults trying to make conversation, not the television playing in the background. It was the unmistakable laughter of 3 5-year-old children who had spent most of their lives learning how to stay quiet. Tae-hyun stopped halfway down the corridor. His security details stopped behind him. Nobody had expected him home that night. And then he heard a woman's voice coming from the kitchen, a Black American woman named Zuri Bennett. 6 weeks earlier, she had entered this mansion as an employee nobody expected to last. Now she was standing in the middle of Tae-hyun's kitchen with flour on her cheek, surrounded by his triplets, while the children laughed as if the darkest years of their childhood had never happened. But what happened next was the reason Tae-hyun couldn't move. Little Ji-an suddenly dropped the wooden spoon in her hand, ran across the kitchen, wrapped both arms around Zuri's waist, and said the one word that made the entire room go silent. "Mommy." Tae-hyun's face changed. He had buried his wife 3 years earlier. Since then, none of his children had called another woman that word. Not once. He stared at Zuri as though he were seeing her for the first time. Then he looked at his daughter. "What did you just call her?" Ji-an didn't answer. She only held Zuri tighter. And Zuri, who had no idea what that word meant to the man standing in the doorway, slowly turned around. What Tae-hyun didn't know was that the strange scene in his kitchen had begun 6 weeks earlier, when Zuri accepted a job that came with one warning. Nobody lasted long inside the house. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 6 weeks before Kang Tae-hyun stood frozen in the doorway of his kitchen, Zuri Bennett was sitting alone outside a staffing agency in Seoul, staring at a message from her mother that she had read so many times the words had stopped looking real. The message was short. The family needed money. A deadline was approaching. If they couldn't make the payment, the home Zuri's mother had spent years protecting could be lost. Zuri was 24 years old, thousands of miles from everything familiar, and already working more hours than she could handle. She had come to South Korea believing she could build a life through honest work, but reality had been less generous. Rent kept rising. Bills kept arriving. Every paycheck disappeared before she could breathe. And now there was a problem she couldn't solve with another shift at a restaurant or another week of cleaning houses. She needed a job that could change her family's situation quickly. What she didn't know was that, less than an hour later, someone would offer her exactly that job, and accepting it would place her inside one of the most dangerous households in Seoul. The call came from a staffing director named Claire Morgan, an American woman who had worked with private households for years. Her voice was professional, but there was something unusually careful about the way she spoke. She asked Zuri to come back inside. There was a position available: live-in household staff, cooking, housekeeping, and childcare. The salary was several times higher than anything Zuri had earned before. There would be housing, transportation, and a signing payment large enough to solve the immediate crisis facing her family. For a woman who had spent months counting every dollar, the offer sounded less like employment and more like an escape route. But Claire didn't slide the contract across the desk immediately. Instead, she looked at Zuri for several seconds and asked a question that seemed completely unrelated to the salary. "How good are you with children?" Zuri answered honestly. "Good enough that children usually tell me things they won't tell adults." Claire's expression changed. "Then you might be exactly what they're looking for." She finally placed the folder on the desk. The name printed across the first page was Kang Tae-hyun. Zuri recognized the name immediately. Almost everyone who followed business news in Seoul had heard it. Kang Tae-hyun was 31, young enough to surprise people and powerful enough to make people lower their voices when discussing him. Publicly, he controlled a network of shipping, logistics, hospitality, and private investment companies. Privately, rumors connected him to a criminal organization whose reach extended far beyond the legitimate businesses carrying his name. South Korean organized crime has existed in different forms across modern history, and researchers have documented links between organized crime, business, and influence. Although the fictional image of a single all-powerful Korean mafia is largely a storytelling device rather than a literal description of South Korea's criminal landscape. But Zuri wasn't interested in the rumors. She was interested in the number on the contract. It could keep her family from losing their home. She asked Claire one question. "What's the catch?" Claire didn't answer immediately. Then she said, 14. Zuri frowned. 14 what? 14 caregivers. Claire turned the folder toward her. 14 people have taken this position in the last 11 months. None stayed longer than 6 weeks. Zuri stared at her. 14 caregivers, 11 months. It wasn't the salary that suddenly felt strange. It was the number. Claire explained that the household belonged to Tae-hyun and that his 3 children were 5-year-old triplets, Min-jae, Seo-jun, and Ji-an. Their mother had died years earlier, and since then the children had rejected nearly every caregiver brought into the house. Some lasted days, others lasted weeks. One had walked out before finishing her first night. Another had demanded to be transferred after the children locked themselves in a bedroom and refused to speak for nearly 6 hours. Claire didn't describe the children as cruel. She described them as wounded, but there was another problem. Their father was almost never home, and when he was home, nobody wanted to be the person who gave him bad news. Zuri closed the folder. "Why me?" she asked. Claire said, "Because you have the right background, the right experience, and the right temperament." Zuri wasn't convinced. "That's not the whole answer." Claire looked down at the contract. "No, it isn't." There was one condition written into the agreement that immediately caught Zuri's attention. If she accepted, she would commit to the household for 1 year. She would have her own room. Her expenses would be covered. Her family would receive the first payment immediately. But leaving early would cost her the financial security she desperately needed. Zuri read every line twice. Then she looked up. "If the children are so difficult, why are you paying this much?" Claire replied, "Because Mr. Kang doesn't care how much it costs anymore. He wants someone who can make his children feel safe." Zuri asked, "And if I can't?" Claire's answer was quiet. "Then you leave like the others." Zuri almost laughed. "You said I couldn't leave." Claire corrected herself. "You can leave the job, but you may not be able to walk away from the consequences." That sentence stayed with Zuri as she signed the contract. She didn't know it yet, but the warning wasn't really about the children. It was about what happened when Kang Tae-hyun became emotionally attached to someone, and according to the people who knew him best, that was something he had spent 3 years making sure would never happen again. There was another detail Claire deliberately withheld. Tae-hyun had not simply approved the staffing agency's shortlist. He had made one unusual request. He wanted a Black American caregiver. No explanation. No preference for age beyond the general employment requirements. No explanation for why nationality mattered. Just one instruction sent directly from his office. Find someone from the United States, preferably someone who had experience with children. Zuri didn't know that when she signed the contract. Claire didn't tell her because Tae-hyun had specifically instructed the agency to keep that detail private until she arrived. Why would a Korean mafia boss with access to some of the wealthiest families in Seoul specifically request a Black American woman to care for his children? At that moment, Zuri had no answer. She assumed it was a coincidence. It wasn't. Someone had already looked into her background before her name ever appeared on that contract. Someone knew about her family. Someone knew where she came from. And someone inside Tae-hyun's organization had a reason for putting her inside that mansion. The following morning, Zuri was driven through the gates of the Kang estate. She expected chaos. She expected screaming. She expected 3 children who would immediately test every boundary she had. Instead, the mansion was silent, almost unnaturally silent. The staff moved around her without making eye contact. Nobody smiled. Nobody asked where she came from. Even the housekeeper, Madame O, seemed nervous when she handed Zuri the keys to her room. Zuri finally asked, "Where are the children?" Madame O looked toward the staircase. "Waiting. For me? They've been waiting for every new caregiver." Zuri climbed the stairs and stopped outside the children's room. She expected noise. Instead, there was nothing. She opened the door. Min-jae, Seo-jun, and Ji-an were sitting together on the floor, perfectly still. 3 5-year-old children staring at a stranger as though they already knew exactly how this story would end. Zuri didn't introduce herself immediately. Neither did they. Then Min-jae slowly looked up at her and said the words that would follow her through the next 6 weeks. "You're going to leave too." Zuri didn't answer right away. She looked at Min-jae, then at Seo-jun, then at little Ji-an, who was holding an old photograph against her chest. Zuri could have promised she would stay. She could have told them she was different. She could have made the same mistake 14 adults had apparently made before her. Instead, she sat down on the floor several feet away. "Maybe," she said. Min-jae's eyes narrowed. "They all said they wouldn't," Zuri nodded. "Then they shouldn't have promised." Seo-jun looked at her differently. Ji-an finally lowered the photograph. Zuri didn't ask who was in it, not yet. She had learned something important in her first 30 seconds inside that room. These children weren't waiting for a nanny. They were waiting for another person to prove them right. They expected Zuri to disappear. They expected Tae-hyun to remain distant. They expected the mansion to stay cold. What they didn't know was that Zuri had already decided one thing before she walked through that door. She wasn't going to spend her time trying to make 3 frightened children love her. She was going to find out what had frightened them in the first place. And the answer was hidden inside that photograph Ji-an was still refusing to put down. The first morning inside Kang Tae-hyun's mansion began with a challenge. Zuri Bennett woke before sunrise, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had already learned something about the household during her first night. The children were awake long before the adults realized it. At 5:42 a.m., she heard footsteps moving across the hallway outside her room. Then silence. Then another set of footsteps. Zuri opened the door and found Min-jae standing several feet away, watching her. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask for breakfast. He simply looked at her as if he were trying to determine whether she was worth remembering. Zuri smiled slightly. "You hungry?" Min-jae shook his head. "Good," Zuri said. "Then you can help me make breakfast." His expression hardened. "I said no," Zuri nodded. "And I heard you." Then she walked toward the kitchen without arguing. She didn't chase him. She didn't threaten him. She didn't try to impress him. But after a few seconds, she heard small footsteps behind her. Min-jae had followed. By 7 o'clock, Zuri understood why 14 caregivers had failed. The problem wasn't that the triplets were spoiled. It wasn't that they were disobedient. And it wasn't that they enjoyed making adults miserable. The children were testing every person who entered their lives because they had already learned the most painful lesson a child can learn: people leave. Min-jae tested Zuri by refusing simple instructions. Seo-jun questioned almost everything she said. He wanted to know where she was born, why she came to Korea, whether she had children, whether she planned to leave, and how long she intended to stay. Ji-an was different. She barely spoke at all. She watched. When Zuri entered a room, Ji-an watched her hands. When Zuri walked away, Ji-an watched the door. When Zuri laughed, Ji-an looked surprised, as if the sound itself didn't belong inside the mansion. Zuri noticed every detail. She had initially thought her job was going to be controlling 3 difficult children. By breakfast, she realized her real job was something else. She had to convince 3 frightened children that the next adult who entered their lives wasn't automatically another person preparing to disappear. So Zuri changed the rules. She stopped asking them to trust her. She stopped telling them she would stay forever. She didn't make promises she couldn't guarantee. Instead, she gave them something much simpler. Consistency. If she said breakfast would be ready at 7, it was ready at 7. If she said she would read them a story after dinner, she read the story. If Min-jae refused to eat, she didn't force him. If Seo-jun asked 10 questions, she answered 10 questions. And if Ji-an sat quietly in the corner, Zuri let her sit there. That morning, Zuri made breakfast using ingredients already available in the mansion. She prepared eggs, fruit, toast, and a small plate of food with flavors that reminded her of home. Min-jae immediately pushed his plate away. "I don't want it." Zuri didn't argue. "Okay." Seo-jun looked at his brother, then at Zuri's plate. He waited until he thought she wasn't watching, reached over and took a tiny piece. He chewed slowly. Zuri pretended not to notice. Seo-jun took another piece. This time Min-jae noticed. "You said you didn't want it." Seo-jun shrugged. "I changed my mind." Zuri smiled to herself. It was a tiny victory, but she understood something important. In that house, tiny victories were the only kind that mattered. Later that afternoon, Zuri found Ji-an sitting alone near the window with the same old photograph she had been holding when Zuri first entered the bedroom. Zuri didn't ask to see it. Instead, she sat on the other side of the room and began folding laundry. For nearly 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Ji-an asked quietly, "Are you going to sleep here?" Zuri looked up. "Yes." Ji-an's eyes remained on the photograph. "For how long?" Zuri could have said 1 year. That was what the contract said, but she remembered Min-jae's words from the previous night. "You're going to leave too," so she gave Ji-an the truth. "I don't know yet." Ji-an finally looked at her. "Everyone says they don't know." Zuri stopped folding. "Who told you that?" Ji-an didn't answer. She hugged the photograph tighter and looked toward the hallway. Zuri followed her gaze. There was something about that reaction that made her uncomfortable. Not because Ji-an was afraid of Zuri. She was afraid of someone who wasn't there. And for the first time, Zuri began to wonder whether the children were carrying memories much heavier than a 5-year-old should have to carry. That evening, Zuri prepared dinner. Min-jae complained about the vegetables. Seo-jun asked why adults always told children to eat things they wouldn't eat themselves. Ji-an said nothing, but she stayed at the table the entire time. That mattered. After dinner, Zuri brought out 3 books and told them they could choose one story before bed. Min-jae picked an adventure story. Seo-jun chose a book about animals. Ji-an chose nothing. She simply watched her brothers. Zuri didn't force her. When the story ended, Min-jae looked at Zuri and asked a question that seemed simple but wasn't. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" Zuri paused. The question was almost identical to the one Ji-an had asked earlier, but this time she understood what was really being asked. They weren't asking about her schedule. They were asking whether they were worth returning to. Zuri looked directly at Min-jae. "If you want me to." Min-jae frowned. "That's not an answer." Zuri smiled. "Then here's a better one. I'll be here in the morning." Min-jae studied her face. Seo-jun looked at the clock. Ji-an lowered her eyes. Nobody said thank you. Nobody hugged her. But when Zuri walked toward the door, Min-jae quietly followed her into the hallway that should have been the end of the day. It wasn't. At 11:18 that night, Zuri woke to a faint sound outside her bedroom. She opened the door and saw a small shadow disappear around the corner. She followed it quietly. The mansion was almost completely dark. She reached the children's hallway and noticed something strange. Their bedroom door was open, but the room was empty. Zuri checked the bathroom. Empty. She checked the playroom. Empty. Then she noticed a narrow door at the far end of the hallway that she hadn't seen earlier. It was locked. She heard something behind it, a quiet movement, then a whisper. Zuri crouched down and placed her hand against the door. "Min-jae." Silence. "Seo-jun." Nothing. "Ji-an." A small voice finally answered. "Go away." Zuri recognized Seo-jun's voice. She didn't force the door. Instead, she asked, "Why are you sleeping in there?" There was a long pause. Then Seo-jun whispered something that changed the way Zuri looked at the entire mansion. "Because that's where Mommy used to sleep." Zuri froze. She looked at the locked door again. "Your mommy?" she asked. Seo-jun didn't answer. Ji-an began crying softly behind the door. Min-jae told his brother to stop talking. Zuri could hear the children moving closer together. She wanted to ask what had happened to their mother, but something inside her told her not to push them. Instead, she sat down on the floor outside the locked room. "Okay," she said quietly. "I won't come in." The children became silent. Zuri stayed there. She didn't know how long, 10 minutes, 20, maybe more. Eventually, she heard Ji-an's voice through the door. "Mommy used to wait here for Daddy." Zuri's heart tightened. "Did she?" Ji-an whispered. "Until the night she didn't." Zuri stared into the darkness. That sentence didn't sound like something a 5-year-old should be able to say. It sounded rehearsed, remembered, repeated so many times that it had become part of the child's understanding of the world. What Zuri didn't know was that Kang Tae-hyun was standing at the other end of the hallway. He had come home silently, as he always did, and had seen Zuri sitting outside that locked room. He didn't interrupt her. He simply watched. He knew what was behind that door. He knew why his children were afraid of it. And he knew something Zuri did not. Nobody had been allowed inside that room since his wife died. Not the housekeeper, not the security staff, not the caregivers, not even Tae-hyun himself. Yet somehow, on her first day, Zuri had found the one place in the mansion where the past was still alive. Tae-hyun watched her put her back against the wall and remain there until the children finally fell asleep. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't demand information. She simply stayed. And that was the moment something inside Tae-hyun began to change. Because for 3 years, everyone who entered his house had tried to erase the pain. Zuri was the first person who seemed willing to sit beside it. But the following morning, Zuri would discover that the locked room wasn't the only secret the triplets had been protecting. The photograph Ji-an carried everywhere showed their mother standing beside Tae-hyun on the day the children were born. But in the corner of that photograph, almost hidden behind the curtain, was another person. A man Zuri had never seen before. A man Tae-hyun had never mentioned. And when Zuri asked Madame O who he was, the older woman's face lost all its color. She took the photograph from Zuri's hands and whispered only 6 words. "You were never supposed to see him." That was when Zuri realized the children weren't simply grieving their mother. They were protecting a secret. And someone inside the Kang household was terrified that Zuri had begun to uncover it. By the 9th day, Zuri Bennett had learned that Kang Tae-hyun was less a man who entered rooms than a presence that changed them. People straightened when he walked past. Conversations ended when his name was mentioned. Even Madame O, who had worked inside the mansion for years, seemed to choose her words more carefully whenever Tae-hyun was nearby. Zuri had heard enough about him to know that most people were afraid of the 31-year-old Korean Mafia boss. She simply hadn't decided whether she should be one of them. That decision was made for her one night when the kitchen door opened just after midnight. Zuri was standing at the stove preparing warm milk for Ji-an, who had woken from another nightmare. She turned and found Tae-hyun standing in the doorway wearing a black suit, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable. He looked at the kitchen as though he had forgotten it existed. Then his eyes moved to Zuri. "You're the new caregiver." It wasn't a question. Zuri nodded. "Zuri Bennett." Tae-hyun walked farther into the room. 14 people came before you." Zuri continued stirring the milk. "I heard." He stopped several feet away. "Then you also heard that none of them stayed." Zuri looked over her shoulder. "I heard that too." Tae-hyun's eyes narrowed. "Everyone who works here eventually learns to be afraid." Zuri turned off the stove, lifted the cup, and met his gaze without lowering hers. "Then I suppose I'm behind schedule." For several seconds, neither of them moved. Tae-hyun had spent years surrounded by people who measured every word before speaking to him. Employees agreed with him. Business partners feared disappointing him. Rivals feared crossing him. Even people who hated him usually understood the danger of letting their emotions show. Yet here was Zuri Bennett, 24 years old, standing in his kitchen in an ordinary house uniform, holding warm milk for his daughter, speaking to him as if he were simply another difficult man who happened to have too much power. Tae-hyun should have been angry. Instead, something about her answer caught him off guard. He looked toward the cup in her hands. "For Ji-an, she had a nightmare." "Again," Zuri nodded. Tae-hyun's jaw tightened. "She does that often." "I know." "How?" Zuri walked past him with the milk. "Because I've been here 9 days." She stopped at the kitchen doorway and looked back. "And because somebody has to notice." Tae-hyun said nothing. Zuri disappeared upstairs. He remained in the kitchen, staring at the place where she had been standing. He had spent 3 years convincing himself that nobody needed to understand his children better than he did. But for the first time, he wondered whether that belief had been protecting him or failing them. The next morning, Tae-hyun saw something even more unsettling. His 3 children were sitting at the breakfast table together, not fighting, not refusing food, not staring at the floor. They were talking. Min-jae was complaining that Seo-jun had taken the biggest piece of fruit. Seo-jun was arguing that he had only taken it because Min-jae wasn't eating it. Ji-an was laughing at both of them. Tae-hyun stopped at the entrance. Nobody noticed him immediately. Zuri was standing near the counter preparing another plate. Then Ji-an looked up and smiled. "Daddy!" Tae-hyun froze. His daughter rarely ran toward him anymore, but she didn't run toward him this time. She pointed toward the table. "Zuri made breakfast." Tae-hyun looked at Zuri. She simply nodded. "They were hungry." He looked back at the children. Min-jae was actually eating. Seo-jun was asking Zuri whether she knew how to make pancakes. Ji-an was trying to feed a piece of fruit to her brother while laughing. Tae-hyun hadn't seen his children like this in years. He had paid doctors, therapists, tutors, private caregivers, and specialists to bring back the happiness that had disappeared from the mansion. None of them had succeeded. Zuri had been there 9 days. That afternoon, Tae-hyun began watching her more closely. He noticed that Zuri never forced the children to talk about their mother. She never asked them questions simply because she wanted information. She never used their fear to control them. When Min-jae became angry, she gave him space. When Seo-jun became curious, she answered him. When Ji-an became frightened, Zuri didn't tell her there was nothing to fear. She simply stayed beside her until the fear passed. Tae-hyun realized that Zuri had done something nobody else had managed to do. She had made the children feel that they were allowed to be children again. But there was another thing that bothered him. The triplets were beginning to look for Zuri before they looked for him. At first, he told himself it didn't matter. Then one evening, he entered the living room and heard Ji-an laughing at something Zuri had said. Tae-hyun stopped in the doorway. Ji-an looked happier than he had seen her in months. Something inside him tightened. Not anger. Something he didn't have a name for yet. That night, Tae-hyun found Zuri in the hallway outside the children's rooms. He asked her to come downstairs. Zuri followed him into the study. The room was large, quiet, and filled with evidence of the life Tae-hyun had built: business awards, photographs, documents, and shelves containing files nobody touched without permission. Zuri stood near the door. Tae-hyun remained behind his desk. "You've been here 9 days," he said. "Yes. My children are different." Zuri said nothing. "What did you do?" "Nothing." Tae-hyun looked at her. "That's not true." Zuri folded her arms. "Then perhaps you're asking the wrong question." His expression hardened. "What does that mean?" Zuri took a breath. "Your children don't need another person who is afraid of you." The room went completely still. Tae-hyun stared at her. Zuri continued before he could respond. "They need their father." He looked away for a moment. "You don't know anything about being their father." Zuri answered quietly. "You're right, I don't. But I know what children look like when they're waiting for someone to notice they're hurting." Tae-hyun's face changed. Zuri had touched something he had spent years keeping locked away. Tae-hyun asked her why she believed he didn't notice. Zuri didn't accuse him of being a bad father. She told him something much harder to hear. "Because you're always protecting them from the world, but you're not always present enough to see what they're afraid of inside the house." Tae-hyun stared at her. "You think I'm not present? I think you love them." Zuri paused. "But love and presence aren't always the same thing." Tae-hyun's eyes hardened again. "You should be careful." Zuri nodded. "I know. Most people would have apologized by now. I'm not most people." A faint change crossed his face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest thing Zuri had seen from him. "I've noticed." He dismissed her. But after she left, Tae-hyun remained alone in the study for several minutes. He looked at a photograph of his children from years earlier. They had been smiling then. He had almost forgotten what those smiles looked like. 2 days later, Tae-hyun discovered something that changed his opinion of Zuri even more. His security team had reviewed the household's recent expenses. Nothing was missing. Nothing suspicious had happened. But there were several small purchases that caught his attention. Children's shoes, art supplies, a nightlight, a children's blanket, a particular stuffed animal. The amounts were insignificant compared with Tae-hyun's wealth, but the purchases had not been charged to the household account. They had been paid for in cash, by Zuri. Tae-hyun asked the security chief to confirm it. The answer was yes. Zuri had been spending part of her own salary on things the children needed. Tae-hyun found her in the kitchen that evening. A small package was sitting on the counter. Zuri was removing the wrapping. Inside was a replacement nightlight for Jaehyun's room. Tae-hyun picked it up. "You bought this?" Zuri turned around. "Yes." "With your money?" She hesitated. "Yes." "Why?" Zuri looked at the nightlight. "Because hers broke." Tae-hyun's voice became colder. "You could have asked the household staff." "I did. And they said they'd replace it next week." Tae-hyun stared at her. "So you bought one yourself?" Jaehyun was afraid of the dark tonight. He looked at her for several seconds. "Why didn't you ask me?" Zuri finally met his eyes. "Because I knew you'd say yes." That answer hit Tae-hyun harder than an argument would have. He had expected her to say she couldn't afford to wait. He expected her to say she was embarrassed. He expected her to say she didn't want to bother him. Instead, she had simply assumed that if he knew his daughter needed something, he would provide it. There was trust in that assumption, but there was also something else. Zuri wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying to win his favor. She hadn't even told anyone what she had done. She had spent her own money because a 5-year-old girl needed something that night. Tae-hyun looked down at the nightlight again. "You could have asked." Zuri shrugged. "I know. Then why didn't you?" "Because sometimes people don't need money, they need someone to notice." Tae-hyun looked at her. The same words again, notice. It was becoming difficult to ignore the pattern. This woman had entered his house less than 2 weeks earlier, and somehow she was forcing him to see things he had spent years refusing to look at. What Tae-hyun didn't tell Zuri was that he had already started making inquiries about her. He knew where she had lived before coming to Korea. He knew about her family. He knew she had accepted the position because of a financial crisis. He knew she had never been connected to any criminal organization. But there was one thing his investigation couldn't explain. Why had she been so specifically chosen for his household? Tae-hyun had never asked the agency for a Black American caregiver before. He had never even cared about nationality. Yet 6 weeks before Zuri entered his mansion, someone had sent him her name. Someone had told him that Zuri Bennett would be the right person for his children. Tae-hyun had assumed it was an ordinary staffing recommendation. Now he wasn't so sure. Because the more he watched Zuri, the more he realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't simply changing his children. She was changing him, and somewhere inside the mansion, someone else had noticed it too. Ha-rin had not yet met Zuri face to face, but she had already heard enough. Tae-hyun was coming home earlier. The children were eating again. Ji-an had started laughing. And the man Ha-rin had spent years expecting to marry was beginning to ask questions about a 24-year-old Black American woman who had arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a contract. Ha-rin didn't know Zuri yet. She didn't need to. She understood Tae-hyun well enough to recognize the danger. The problem wasn't that Zuri was becoming important to the children. The real problem was that Tae-hyun was beginning to care about what happened to her. And when Ha-rin finally entered the mansion, she would discover that Zuri wasn't the only person hiding something. Someone had already begun searching through the family's past, and the answer to that mystery was connected to the woman Tae-hyun had never stopped grieving. By the time Yoon Ha-rin arrived at the Kang mansion, Zuri Bennett had been inside the household for just over 2 weeks, but the atmosphere had already changed. Ha-rin noticed it before anyone said a word. She was 26, elegant, wealthy, and accustomed to being welcomed wherever she went. Her family had known Kang Tae-hyun for years, and for a long time, everyone around them had assumed their relationship would eventually become a marriage. Ha-rin had never questioned it. Tae-hyun was powerful, disciplined, respected, and connected to one of the most influential families in Seoul. More importantly, he had never publicly rejected the possibility of a future with her. So when she stepped through the mansion doors that afternoon, she expected to see the same cold household she had always known. Instead, she heard laughter. Then 3 little voices shouted Zuri's name. Min-jae, Seo-jun, and Ji-an came running down the stairs toward the Black American woman as if she had been part of their lives for years. Ha-rin stopped walking. She watched Zuri kneel down and catch Ji-an in her arms while Seo-jun excitedly explained something, and Min-jae tried to pretend he wasn't happy to see her. Ha-rin smiled politely, but inside, she understood immediately that something had changed. Zuri noticed Ha-rin standing near the entrance and slowly rose to her feet. Their eyes met. Ha-rin approached with the confidence of someone who believed the house already belonged to her future. "You must be Zuri Bennett," she said. Zuri nodded. "And you're Yoon Ha-rin." Ha-rin smiled. "You've heard of me," Zuri answered honestly. "Your name comes up." Ha-rin glanced toward the triplets. "I can see they've become attached to you." Zuri looked at the children. "They're good kids." Ha-rin's smile remained, but her tone became colder. "They're Tae-hyun's children." Attachment can become complicated in this household. Zuri understood the warning. She didn't react. Ha-rin stepped closer. "You should remember your position." Zuri didn't argue. She simply looked at her and said, "I do. I'm the person your children trust." Ha-rin's expression changed for the briefest moment. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected Zuri to apologize or step backward. Instead, the younger woman had calmly reminded her of the one fact Ha-rin couldn't challenge. The triplets trusted Zuri, and Tae-hyun had begun to notice. That evening, Ha-rin stayed for dinner. Tae-hyun joined them late. He entered the dining room expecting the usual quiet, but instead found his children arguing over who would sit beside Zuri. Min-jae had already moved his chair. Seo-jun was explaining a complicated story about something that happened at school. Ji-an was leaning against Zuri's arm. Tae-hyun stopped briefly at the doorway. Ha-rin watched his face. She saw something she had never seen directed toward another woman. It wasn't simply affection. It was attention. Tae-hyun looked at Zuri as though he was trying to understand how she had managed to change the house without asking permission. Ha-rin noticed that too. During dinner, she deliberately asked Tae-hyun about a business event happening later that week. He answered, but his eyes kept returning to the children. When Ji-an laughed, he looked at her. When Zuri corrected Min-jae gently, he watched her. Ha-rin understood that the dinner wasn't about business anymore. Zuri had become the center of the household without ever asking to be. Later, when the children were upstairs, Ha-rin found Tae-hyun alone in his study. She closed the door behind her. "You trust her?" Tae-hyun looked up from his desk. "Who?" Ha-rin almost laughed. "Zuri." He leaned back. "She's been good with the children." Ha-rin studied him. "That's all." Tae-hyun's expression hardened. "What are you suggesting?" Ha-rin lowered her voice. "I'm suggesting that you don't know her." Tae-hyun said nothing. Ha-rin walked toward the desk. You know where she works, you know where she came from, but do you know why she accepted this particular job? Do you know why she was willing to enter a house where 14 people already failed? Tae-hyun's eyes narrowed. What are you saying? Ha-rin hesitated just long enough to make the accusation sound reluctant. I'm saying she may have been looking for something. Tae-hyun stood. Be specific. Ha-rin finally said it. Your wife. Room became silent. Tae-hyun's face changed immediately. For 3 years, almost nobody had spoken about his late wife unless he brought her up first. Her death had become a subject the household avoided. Ha-rin knew that. She also knew exactly what would happen if someone suggested that Zuri had been searching through the past. I heard she's been asking questions, Ha-rin continued. About the locked room, about your wife's things, about what happened the night she died. Tae-hyun's voice was quiet. Who told you that? Ha-rin didn't answer directly. People talk. Tae-hyun stared at her. People talk because you give them reasons to. Ha-rin's expression tightened. I'm trying to protect you. He walked around the desk. Then tell me what you actually know. Ha-rin looked him in the eye. I know Zuri has been near records that haven't been touched in years. Tae-hyun's jaw tightened. Leave. Ha-rin looked surprised. Tae-hyun, I said leave. She picked up her purse. Before walking out, she turned back. You should find out what she's really doing here. Accusation should have been easy to dismiss. Tae-hyun knew Zuri had been helping his children. He had seen her kindness himself. He had watched her spend her own money on Jaehyun's nightlight. He had watched her sit outside the locked room instead of forcing the children to explain what happened there. He had watched her bring laughter back into a house that had been quiet for years. But there was one thing Ha-rin had done deliberately. She had placed a question inside his mind that he couldn't ignore. Tae-hyun went downstairs and found Zuri in the kitchen preparing something for the children. She looked up and immediately noticed the change in his expression. Is something wrong? Tae-hyun didn't answer. He placed a photograph on the counter. It was a picture of his late wife. Have you been asking questions about her? Zuri stared at the photograph. Her expression changed. Who told you that? Answer me. Zuri looked directly at him. No. Tae-hyun's eyes remained fixed on hers. You've never asked about my wife. I've asked about the children. That's not what I asked. Zuri shook her head. No, I haven't been investigating her. Tae-hyun stepped closer. You've been near her belongings. Zuri's voice became firmer. Because Ji-an has been carrying her photograph around, because your children are sleeping in the room where she used to stay. Because someone locked that room and expected 3 5-year-old children to understand what happened inside it. Tae-hyun said nothing. Zuri continued. I didn't investigate your wife. I tried to understand your children. He watched her carefully. There was no obvious fear in her expression, but there was hurt. Why would Ha-rin say otherwise? Zuri asked. Tae-hyun didn't answer. Zuri looked at the photograph again. If you don't trust me, just say it. Tae-hyun's face remained cold. Trust has to be earned. Zuri nodded slowly. Then maybe you should remember that I earned it with your children. She turned away from him. Tae-hyun almost stopped her, but something held him back. He had spent years training himself to listen to evidence instead of emotion. If someone had accessed his wife's files, he needed to know who. And if Zuri was involved, he needed proof. The proof appeared before midnight. Tae-hyun's security chief, Park Di-sung, entered the study carrying a tablet. He had reviewed the mansion's security logs and digital records. Someone had accessed archived files connected to Tae-hyun's late wife. The files had been sealed for years. Only a handful of people had authorization. Tae-hyun looked at the screen. The access record showed an employee identification number. Zuri Bennett's employee credentials. Tae-hyun's expression became unreadable. When? He asked. Di-sung gave him the date. It was 3 days after Zuri arrived. Tae-hyun stared at the screen. Could someone else use her credentials? Di-sung hesitated. Technically, yes. Tae-hyun looked at him. But, Di-sung continued. The system recorded her credentials. It also recorded movement through the archive corridor. Tae-hyun asked, do we have camera footage? Di-sung shook his head. The camera in that corridor was disabled for exactly 11 minutes. Tae-hyun's eyes narrowed. Someone had planned this. For the first time, the pieces seemed to point toward Zuri. Her credentials had been used. She had been near the locked room. She had asked questions about the children. And she had entered the household only weeks earlier. But there was one detail Tae-hyun couldn't explain. If Zuri had actually been investigating his wife, why would she leave a digital trail that pointed directly to herself? Someone with enough intelligence to enter his mansion would understand that his security system recorded everything. The evidence was almost too convenient. Tae-hyun ordered Ji-sung to keep investigating without telling anyone. He didn't want Zuri arrested. He didn't want her frightened. He wanted the truth. When he saw her the next morning, he couldn't look at her the same way. Zuri noticed immediately. She asked him what was wrong. Tae-hyun simply said, "Nothing." But his eyes had already changed. Zuri didn't know that someone had used her credentials. She didn't know that the archive camera had been disabled. She didn't know that Ha-rin had planted the first doubt in Tae-hyun's mind. All she knew was that the man who had slowly begun trusting her was suddenly distant again. Min-jae noticed it too. He asked Zuri why his father wasn't talking to her. She told him everything was fine. Min-jae didn't believe her. Neither did Seo-jun. Jae and simply held Zuri's hand tighter. That night, Zuri returned to her room and found an envelope beneath her door. There was no name on it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Tae-hyun's late wife standing outside the mansion on the night before she died. Zuri stared at it. Then she noticed something in the background. A black vehicle was parked across the street. She recognized the symbol on its windshield. It belonged to Jang Hyun-woo's organization. Zuri's heart began racing. She looked toward the hallway. Someone had left that photograph for her deliberately. It wasn't a threat. It was a message. But why would the rival Mafia boss want her to see it? And why had someone used her employee credentials to access the same records she had never touched? Zuri suddenly understood that the accusation against her might be part of something much larger. Before she could think further, she heard footsteps outside her door. She opened it. Nobody was there, but on the floor was another envelope. This one contained only one sentence. "Ask Tae-hyun what happened the night his wife died." Zuri stared at the words. She didn't know who had sent them. She didn't know whether they wanted to help her or destroy her. And she didn't know that Tae-hyun was standing downstairs looking at the same photograph from the security file, asking himself a question he had never wanted to ask about the woman who had entered his life 6 weeks earlier. Could Zuri Bennett really be investigating his dead wife? Or had someone deliberately placed her inside his mansion because they knew she would eventually uncover the truth? Tae-hyun had trusted almost nobody for 3 years. Now, for the first time, he had begun to trust Zuri. And that was exactly what made the betrayal, if it was a betrayal, so dangerous. Because when Tae-hyun finally looked at Zuri again, the warmth that had begun to appear in his eyes was gone. In its place was suspicion. And Zuri had no idea that the next thing he discovered would make him question whether she had ever entered his mansion by accident. The suspicion changed everything. For the first time since Zuri Bennett had entered the Kang mansion, Kang Tae-hyun no longer looked at her as the woman who had brought laughter back into his children's lives. He looked at her as a question he hadn't answered. Zuri could feel it every time their eyes met. She knew something had happened, but Tae-hyun refused to tell her what it was. When she finally confronted him, he gave her only one sentence. "Stay away from my wife's files." Zuri stared at him. "I told you I never touched them." Tae-hyun's expression remained cold. "Your credentials were used. Then someone used my credentials. And you expect me to believe that?" Zuri's eyes filled with hurt, but she refused to cry in front of him. "You don't have to believe me, but you should know me well enough by now to know I wouldn't hurt your children." Tae-hyun didn't answer. He turned toward Park Ji-sung and quietly ordered him to increase security around the mansion. Then he added something that made Zuri's heart sink. "Keep an eye on her." Zuri heard every word. She looked at Tae-hyun as if he had just become a stranger again. She went upstairs and began packing, not because she wanted to leave the triplets, but because she couldn't remain inside a house where the man she had begun trusting now considered her a possible threat. She folded her clothes carefully. She placed her passport inside her bag. Then she stopped when she saw the small drawing Ji-an had left on her pillow. It showed 4 people holding hands: Zuri, Ji-an, Min-jae, and Seo-jun. Tae-hyun wasn't in the picture. Zuri stared at it for several seconds. She knew leaving would hurt them, but staying could put them in danger if Tae-hyun truly believed she was involved. She wiped her eyes and continued packing. Downstairs, Tae-hyun stood in his study looking at the security report again. He wanted to believe Zuri. That was the problem. 3 weeks earlier, he wouldn't have cared whether she stayed or left. Now the idea of her walking out of his house felt like something being taken from him, but he couldn't allow emotion to compromise his judgment. Not when his children's safety was involved. He ordered Ji-sung to watch every entrance and every employee. He didn't know that the real threat was already inside the perimeter. At 10:43 that night, Zuri finished packing. She walked into the hallway carrying her suitcase. She planned to leave before midnight. She didn't want another confrontation with Tae-hyun. She didn't want the children to see her go. But as she passed the children's room, she heard nothing. That was strange. The triplets were usually awake at that hour, especially Ji-an, who had become attached to Zuri's bedtime stories. Zuri opened the door, empty. She checked the bathroom, empty. The playroom, empty. Her heart began beating faster. She called their names. Min-jae, no answer. Seo-jun, silence. Ji-an, nothing. She dropped her suitcase. Within seconds, she was running through the mansion. She found Madame O in the corridor. Where are the children? Madame O's face changed. They're supposed to be upstairs. Zuri shook her head. They're gone. Madame O immediately called security. Tae-hyun arrived moments later. The moment he heard the words, his entire expression changed. Lock the gates. Dae-sung reached for his radio. All entrances are being secured. Tae-hyun looked at Zuri. Did you last see them? Before dinner. And you didn't notice anything. Zuri's voice cracked. I was packing because you told security to watch me. Tae-hyun's face tightened. For a moment, neither spoke. The mansion went into lockdown. Every gate closed. Every vehicle was checked. Security officers moved through the property room by room. Cameras were reviewed. Doors were inspected. Nothing made sense. There had been no forced entry. No alarms had been triggered. Nobody had seen the children leave. Tae-hyun's organization had protected him from armed attacks, rival gangs, and people who had spent years trying to bring him down. Yet 3 5-year-olds had disappeared from inside his own mansion without a single alarm sounding. Tae-hyun's voice became dangerously calm. Find them, Dae-sung nodded. We will. Zuri stood near the children's room, looking at the floor. Everyone else was searching for doors, windows, footprints, and security breaches. Zuri was looking at the things the children had left behind. Their books were still there. Their blankets were still there. Seo-jun's shoes were beside the bed. Ji-an's favorite photograph was gone. Then Zuri noticed something else. A small wooden toy shaped like a train was missing. It was one of Min-jae's favorite toys. Zuri remembered something he had said days earlier. The train goes where Daddy doesn't go. At the time, she thought it was a child's imagination. Now she knew better. Zuri turned toward Tae-hyun. There's a place. He looked at her. What? The children have been talking about an old train room. Tae-hyun's expression changed. What train room? Zuri explained that Min-jae had once mentioned a place on the estate where an old toy railway had been stored. Tae-hyun immediately asked Dae-sung about it. The security chief hesitated. There is an abandoned service building on the eastern side of the property. Tae-hyun stared at him. Why wasn't that checked? Dae-sung answered, It's been sealed for years. Zuri interrupted. Then that's where they are. Tae-hyun looked at her. How do you know? Zuri held up the missing train toy she had found beneath the children's bed. Because they didn't just disappear, they followed something. Tae-hyun understood immediately. He ordered the security team toward the eastern grounds. Zuri followed. Tae-hyun told her to stay behind. She refused. Your children are there. He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, Stay beside me. It was the first time since the accusation that he had spoken to her without suspicion in his voice. They reached the abandoned building minutes later. The door was slightly open. Tae-hyun raised his hand, stopping everyone. The property was silent, too silent. Dae-sung entered first. Tae-hyun followed. Zuri stayed close behind him. The old building smelled of dust and damp wood. Broken furniture sat beneath sheets. A child's drawing hung crookedly on one wall. Then they heard something, a faint sound from deeper inside. Zuri whispered, Ji-an. Tae-hyun moved faster. They reached an old storage room and found the 3 children huddled together beneath a table. Ji-an was crying. Seo-jun was holding her hand. Min-jae was clutching the wooden train. Tae-hyun dropped to his knees. Min-jae! The boy looked at him and immediately ran into his arms. Seo-jun followed. Ji-an reached for Zuri. Zuri pulled her close. Tae-hyun closed his eyes for 1 second, overwhelmed by relief. His children were alive. They were frightened but alive, yet something was wrong. There was no kidnapper, no guard, no attacker. Whoever had brought them there was gone. Zuri looked around the room. The children hadn't been tied up. Nobody had hurt them. There were bottles of water, blankets, and food placed nearby. Someone had prepared the room for them. Whoever had taken the children hadn't intended to kill them. They had wanted them hidden. That made the situation even more disturbing. Tae-hyun asked Min-jae who had brought them there. The boy shook his head. Seo-jun said he didn't know. Ji-an whispered that someone told them they were going to see Mommy. Tae-hyun froze. Who said that? Ji-an pointed toward the hallway. Nobody was there. Tae-hyun stood and ordered Dae-sung to search the entire building. Zuri noticed something on the floor near an old cabinet, a photograph. She picked it up. It was a picture of Tae-hyun's late wife. She was standing outside the mansion, smiling at the camera. But the picture looked old, almost like it had been kept hidden for years. Zuri turned it over. 3 handwritten words were written on the back. She never died alone. Tae-hyun took the photograph from Zuri's hand. For several seconds, he didn't move. His face lost its color. He had spent 3 years accepting the official explanation for his wife's death, even though a part of him had never believed it. The doctors had called it complications. The family had called it a tragedy. Tae-hyun had called it the worst night of his life. But those 3 words changed the meaning of everything. She never died alone. If the message was true, then someone had been with his wife when she died. Someone who knew what happened. Someone who had hidden the truth for 3 years. Tae-hyun looked at Zuri, then at the children, then back at the photograph. "Why would someone leave this here?" Zuri asked. Tae-hyun didn't answer. He was thinking about the files, the photograph, the locked room. The children's memories, the person who had used Zuri's credentials, the rival Mafia organization. Suddenly the pieces weren't pointing towards Zuri anymore. They were pointing through her. But before Tae-hyun could say anything, Ji-sung returned with another discovery. There were fresh footprints outside the building. Someone had left only minutes earlier. Tae-hyun followed them to the edge of the property, where they disappeared near the old service road. A vehicle had been waiting there. The security cameras had captured only a partial image. It was enough to identify the vehicle. Tae-hyun recognized the symbol immediately. It belonged to Jang Hyun-woo, his rival, the man who had warned him that he was looking in the wrong direction. Tae-hyun's suspicion turned into anger, but there was still one question he couldn't answer. Why had Hyun-woo taken the children without harming them? And why leave behind a photograph connected to Tae-hyun's dead wife? It looked like a threat. But it also looked like an invitation to uncover something buried. Then Zuri noticed another detail. The photograph had been folded once before. Inside the fold was a tiny piece of paper. She carefully pulled it out. There was an address written on it, not a location in Seoul, not a business address. It was an old private clinic outside the city. Tae-hyun stared at the address. His breathing changed. He knew the place. It was where his wife had been taken on the night she died. The clinic had closed 2 years later. The official records had disappeared. Tae-hyun had never returned, until now. Zuri looked at him. "You know this place." He nodded slowly. "I thought everyone connected to it was gone." Zuri asked, "What happened there?" Tae-hyun looked toward his children. "My wife died there." He paused. "Or that's what I was told." The first time, Tae-hyun understood that the night his wife died might not have been the end of the story. It might have been the beginning. Someone had deliberately placed Zuri inside his home. Someone had framed her credentials. Someone had awakened memories inside his children. Someone had taken the triplets to an abandoned building and left behind evidence connecting their mother's death to a secret location. And somewhere beyond the mansion gates, Jang Hyun-woo already knew Tae-hyun was beginning to search for answers. Zuri stood beside him, still holding Ji-an against her chest. Tae-hyun looked at her. His suspicion had not completely disappeared, but it had changed. If Zuri was involved, then she was either part of the plan or the person someone was using as a shield. Either way, she was no longer just a maid. She was now connected to the most dangerous secret Tae-hyun had ever buried. That night, Tae-hyun made a decision. He would take the children somewhere secure. He would investigate the clinic. And he would find the person who had manipulated Zuri's credentials. But there was one thing he didn't tell anyone. Before the children disappeared, his security system had recorded one final unauthorized entry into the mansion. The person had entered through a door that only 3 people knew existed. Tae-hyun was one of them. Ji-sung was another. And the third person had been dead for 3 years. Or at least, everyone believed she was. Tae-hyun stared at the security image until his hands tightened around the edge of the desk. The face wasn't clear. But the silhouette was unmistakable. A woman. And in her hand was the same photograph Zuri had just found. For 3 years, Tae-hyun had believed his wife's death was the tragedy that destroyed his family. Now he was beginning to wonder whether the woman in that photograph had been hiding the truth from him all along. And if she had, the question was no longer simply who had framed Zuri. The question was whether Tae-hyun's wife had left behind a secret that could destroy everyone still alive. By sunrise, Kang Tae-hyun had moved the triplets to a secure property outside the city, but sleep was no longer an option. The photograph of his late wife remained on the desk in front of him, and the 3 words written on its back kept returning to his mind. She never died alone. For 3 years, Tae-hyun had lived with unanswered questions, but now those questions had found a new target. Someone had manipulated Zuri Bennett's employee credentials. Someone had taken his children. Someone had left evidence connecting the disappearance to the night his wife died. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Jang Hyun-woo, the 34-year-old rival Mafia boss who had suddenly become far too interested in Tae-hyun's family. Tae-hyun had spent most of his adult life understanding one basic rule. When a rival gives you information, there is always a price attached. So when Hyun-woo requested a private meeting, Tae-hyun knew it wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse near the river, a location chosen because neither man's security could easily control it. Tae-hyun arrived first. Park Di-sung remained several yards away with the security team, while Zuri stayed with the children at the secure property. Tae-hyun had specifically ordered her not to come. For once, Zuri had agreed. A black vehicle eventually entered the warehouse. Jang Hyun-woo stepped out alone. He was 34, calm, sharply dressed, and carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had survived long enough in Tae-hyun's world to understand exactly how dangerous the other man could be. Hyun-woo didn't bother with greetings. He looked at Tae-hyun and said, "You're looking in the wrong direction." Tae-hyun's expression didn't change. "Then tell me where to look." Hyun-woo smiled slightly. "Inside your own organization." Tae-hyun didn't react, but the statement confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Hyun-woo explained that someone inside Tae-hyun's organization had been manipulating the events surrounding Zuri. The person had access to internal systems, security schedules, archived files, and employee credentials. That meant the person wasn't a low-level employee. They had authority. They understood how Tae-hyun's security worked. They knew which cameras could be disabled without immediately triggering an alert. Most importantly, they knew about the history Tae-hyun had spent 3 years trying to bury. "You're making a serious accusation," Tae-hyun said. Hyun-woo replied, "I'm giving you information." "Why?" "Because the person you're looking for isn't working for me." Tae-hyun stared at him. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" Hyun-woo shook his head. "No, you're supposed to investigate." Then Hyun-woo revealed something that changed the entire conversation. The person manipulating Tae-hyun's organization had been doing it long before Zuri arrived. The files connected to Tae-hyun's wife had been accessed several times over the years. Each time, the records were altered or partially erased. Someone had been cleaning up evidence. Someone had been making sure Tae-hyun never saw the complete story. Zuri's arrival had simply given that person a new opportunity. They used her credentials because they needed someone Tae-hyun would eventually distrust. Hyun-woo looked directly at him. "You didn't bring her into your house because she was dangerous. Someone wanted you to believe she was." Tae-hyun's jaw tightened. "How do you know all this?" Hyun-woo smiled. "Because I've been watching the same person for longer than you have." Tae-hyun stepped closer. "Who is it?" Hyun-woo didn't answer. Instead, he gave him an ultimatum. "Give me Zuri Bennett." Tae-hyun's expression became cold. "No," Hyun-woo continued as though he hadn't heard him. "Give her to me and I make sure this ends." Tae-hyun stared at him. "You expect me to hand over an innocent woman because you claim you can protect her?" Hyun-woo's voice became quieter. "I'm not asking because I want to protect her." Tae-hyun's eyes narrowed. "Then why?" Hyun-woo paused. "Because she's the one thing you've started caring about that your enemies can reach." Tae-hyun understood immediately. Hyun-woo didn't actually need Zuri. He needed what Zuri represented. He needed Tae-hyun emotionally compromised. For years, Tae-hyun had been difficult to manipulate because he trusted almost nobody. Now he had 3 children he loved and a woman he had begun to care about. Hyun-woo had identified the weakness. Tae-hyun refused again. Hyun-woo's expression changed. "Then understand what happens next." Tae-hyun said nothing. "The next person taken won't be one of your children." Tae-hyun's eyes hardened. Hyun-woo continued, "You've already seen what happens when someone wants your attention. They take something you love, they force you to react, they make you choose between your judgment and your emotions." Tae-hyun stepped forward. "If you touch Zuri, I'll destroy everything you have." Hyun-woo smiled. "That's exactly the response I was expecting." Then he turned toward the door. Tae-hyun called after him. "Why are you warning me?" Hyun-woo stopped. "'Cause when you finally discover who betrayed you, you'll understand that I was never your biggest problem." He walked away, leaving Tae-hyun alone with a question that was becoming more dangerous by the minute. When Tae-hyun returned to the secure property, Zuri was waiting. She had heard enough from the security team to know the meeting had happened. She didn't ask what Hyun-woo wanted. She could see the answer in Tae-hyun's face. "He asked for me," she said. Tae-hyun didn't respond. Zuri nodded slowly. "I thought so." Tae-hyun looked at her. "How?" "Because everyone who wants to hurt you eventually finds something you care about." She glanced toward the room where the triplets were sleeping. "And now they know I'm one of those things." Tae-hyun's expression tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." Zuri looked directly at him. "Yes, I do." She stepped closer. "You don't have to pretend with me." Tae-hyun remained silent. Zuri continued. "Hyun-woo doesn't want me. He wants you afraid. He wants you angry. He wants you to make a mistake." Tae-hyun stared at her. She had understood the situation faster than some of his most experienced advisors. That realization frightened Zuri more than the threat itself. She looked toward the children's room and then back at Tae-hyun. "If staying here puts your children in danger, I'll leave." Tae-hyun immediately shook his head. "No." Zuri's voice softened. "Tae-hyun, listen to me," he interrupted. "I said no." She looked at him for several seconds. "You can't protect everyone by keeping me here." Tae-hyun's voice became quiet. "That's exactly what I've been trying to do." Zuri swallowed. "Then let me go." Tae-hyun looked away. Zuri waited. Finally, he turned back toward her. The walls he had built around himself for 3 years seemed to weaken in a single moment. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." Zuri's eyes filled with emotion. "Why?" Tae-hyun didn't answer immediately. He looked at her as though he were seeing the woman from the kitchen again. The woman who had walked into his home and refused to be intimidated. The woman who had sat outside his children's locked room without demanding answers. The woman who had spent her own money on a night light because his daughter was afraid of the dark. Then he said the words he had been avoiding. "Because I don't want you to leave." Zuri stood completely still. Tae-hyun continued, his voice low. "When you first came here, I thought you were another employee. Someone who would stay for a few weeks and disappear like everyone else. Then my children started waiting for you. They started laughing again. Jae-an started sleeping through the night. Min-jae stopped looking at every doorway like he was waiting for someone to leave. Seo-jun started asking questions again, and I realized I was doing the same thing." Zuri whispered. "What?" Tae-hyun took a step closer. "Waiting for you to come home." The words hung between them. Zuri looked down for a moment, then back at him. "Tae-hyun!" He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. For once, neither of them tried to explain what was happening. There was no contract, no mansion, no rival mafia boss, no investigation. Just two people standing in the middle of a crisis who had finally stopped pretending that the feelings between them didn't exist. Tae-hyun moved closer. Zuri hesitated for only a moment before meeting him halfway. Their first kiss was brief and emotional, less about passion than everything they had refused to say. 3 years of grief had kept Tae-hyun from allowing anyone close. Zuri had entered his life believing she was accepting a job. Neither of them had planned for this. When they separated, Zuri rested her forehead against his for a moment. Tae-hyun whispered, "I'm sorry." She asked, "For what?" "For making you afraid that I didn't trust you." Zuri looked at him. "You did." Tae-hyun shook his head. "I was afraid." "Of me?" "Of losing you." Zuri's eyes softened. Before either could say another word, a sharp crack shattered the window behind them. Tae-hyun immediately pulled Zuri down. The glass exploded across the floor. Security rushed into the room. Di-sung shouted for everyone to move away from the windows. Tae-hyun shielded Zuri with his body as another shot struck the wall. The children began crying in the next room. Zuri looked toward them. Tae-hyun looked toward the shattered window. The attack had come from outside, but the timing was too perfect. Someone had known exactly where they would be standing. Someone had known that Tae-hyun would be with Zuri. Someone wanted him to understand that the warning was real. But then Di-sung found something on the floor near the broken window. A small black envelope. Inside was a photograph. It showed Tae-hyun and Zuri standing together only moments earlier. The photograph had been taken from inside the property. Tae-hyun stared at it. His face became cold again. Whoever had fired the shot wasn't simply watching the mansion from outside. They had someone close enough to photograph them from inside the secure property. Hyun-woo's warning returned to his mind. The person you're looking for is inside your own organization. Tae-hyun looked at Zuri, then toward the hallway where his children were being protected. The danger was no longer outside the walls. It was already inside. And now that Tae-hyun had finally admitted that Zuri was the person he feared losing most, his enemies had everything they needed to destroy him. The question was no longer whether Zuri could survive the Kang household. The question was whether Tae-hyun could discover the traitor before that person reached the children again. The gunshot changed everything. Within minutes, Kang Tae-hyun had moved Zuri Bennett and the 3 children to a private property far outside Seoul, a location known only to a handful of people he trusted. The mansion was no longer safe. The security breach had proved that someone inside his organization could reach them, and Tae-hyun could no longer assume that locked doors, armed guards, or surveillance cameras were enough. Min-jae, Seo-jun, and Ji-an were placed in a secured bedroom while Zuri stayed beside them. Tae-hyun remained outside the door, speaking quietly with Park Ji-sung as investigators reviewed every security record from the previous night. But while the adults searched for evidence, the children kept returning to something much older. They kept talking about the night their mother died. At first, Tae-hyun dismissed it as childhood memory mixed with imagination. They had been only 2 years old when it happened. They couldn't possibly remember enough to identify anyone. That was what every adult had assumed for 3 years. But Zuri had learned something about these children that Tae-hyun had forgotten. Children might forget dates, they might forget conversations, but they don't always forget fear. It began when Seo-jun asked Zuri a question while they were sitting together. "Why did Mommy tell us to hide?" Zuri stopped. "When did she tell you that?" Seo-jun looked toward his brother and sister. Min-jae immediately shook his head. Ji-an pulled her blanket closer. Zuri didn't pressure them. "You can tell me when you're ready." Seo-jun looked at the floor. It was the night she died. Tae-hyun heard the conversation from the hallway and entered the room. "Seo-jun." The boy looked at his father. Tae-hyun crouched in front of him. "You don't remember that night?" Seo-jun shook his head. "I do." Tae-hyun's expression changed. "You were 2. Seo-jun answered quietly, "I remember Mommy crying." The room became silent. Tae-hyun looked at Zuri. She didn't say anything. Seo-jun continued. "She told us not to make noise." Min-jae finally spoke. "Someone was yelling." Tae-hyun's face hardened. "Who?" Min-jae looked frightened. "I don't know." Then Seo-jun said something that shattered the version of the past Tae-hyun had believed for 3 years. "Mommy wasn't sick." Tae-hyun froze. He had heard those words before in his own mind, but never from one of his children. The official explanation had always been complications, a medical emergency, a tragic death following childbirth complications that nobody could have prevented. Tae-hyun had been told repeatedly that his wife had become critically ill and that the doctors had done everything possible. He had accepted it because he had been broken, because his children were newborns, and because there had been no reason to believe otherwise. But now his 5-year-old son was telling him that his mother hadn't been sick. Tae-hyun asked Seo-jun what he remembered. The boy closed his eyes. "Mommy was talking to someone." "Who?" "A man." Tae-hyun's voice became quieter. "What man?" Seo-jun shook his head. "I don't know his name." Zuri asked gently, "What did he look like?" Seo-jun thought for several seconds. "He wore black." Tae-hyun almost dismissed the description. Half the men around him wore black. Then Ji-an suddenly spoke. "He had Daddy's ring." Tae-hyun looked at his daughter. "What ring?" Ji-an pointed toward his hand. Tae-hyun wore a distinctive black signet ring bearing the Kang family crest. It was something his organization recognized immediately. His father had worn one. Tae-hyun had inherited it. Senior members of his organization knew what it meant. But Ji-an was 2 years old when her mother died. How could she remember a ring? Tae-hyun took the ring off his finger and placed it in his palm. "This one," Ji-an nodded. "That one." Min-jae suddenly looked at his father. "Mommy said he wasn't Daddy." Tae-hyun's blood ran cold. "What did she say?" Min-jae looked toward Seo-jun. "She said, 'That's not your father.'" Tae-hyun stood slowly. For 3 years, he had believed he had lost his wife to a medical tragedy. Now his children were describing a man who had entered her room before her death, wearing the symbol of Tae-hyun's own family. Someone had been there. Someone had argued with her. Someone had frightened the children. And if the children were telling the truth, then the person had access to the inner circle of Tae-hyun's organization. Tae-hyun immediately called Park Ji-sung. He ordered him to bring the organization's internal records from the year his wife died. Ji-sung hesitated when he heard the reason. Tae-hyun told him to bring everything, not summaries, not reports prepared by advisors, everything: medical records, security logs, visitor records, transportation records, internal communications. Tae-hyun wanted the original information. While Ji-sung worked, Zuri sat with the children and asked them one more question. "Do you remember where Mommy went after the argument?" Ji-an pointed toward the floor. "She went away." Zuri frowned. "Where?" Ji-an looked toward Tae-hyun. The place with the white walls. Tae-hyun immediately understood. The clinic. The same abandoned clinic connected to the photograph. The same address written on the paper Zuri had found. But there was another detail. Seo-jun remembered seeing someone else that night. Someone who had told the children to stay quiet. Someone who had later appeared at the mansion after their mother was declared dead. Someone who had remained close to Tae-hyun ever since. The investigation moved quickly. Di-sung discovered that the official records from the night of Tae-hyun's wife's death contained inconsistencies. One security report had been rewritten. One vehicle entry had been removed. One employee had been listed as being somewhere else when another document placed him at the clinic. That employee was not a stranger. He was a senior member of Tae-hyun's organization who had served as one of his most trusted advisors for years. His name was Choi Yoon-seok. The same man who had advised Tae-hyun on business, handled sensitive documents, and helped manage parts of the family's legitimate operations. Tae-hyun stared at the records in disbelief. Yoon-seok had been there the night his wife died. He had never told Tae-hyun. Worse, his access credentials had been used to enter the archive containing the medical records. But there was still one question. Why frame Zuri? The answer appeared in a recovered security file. 3 days after Zuri entered the mansion, Choi Yoon-seok had accessed the staffing database. He had viewed Zuri's employee credentials. He had also accessed Tae-hyun's wife's archived files. Then someone used Zuri's credentials to enter the restricted archive. Tae-hyun finally understood the plan. Zuri had never been the investigator. She had been the cover. Someone had deliberately used her identity to make Tae-hyun suspect the woman who had become closest to his children. And once he distrusted Zuri, the real person behind the scheme could continue accessing the family's secrets without being noticed. But there was another reason. Choi Yoon-seok had realized that Tae-hyun was becoming emotionally attached to Zuri. If he could make Tae-hyun believe Zuri was betraying him, he could destroy the relationship before it became strong enough to expose the truth. Tae-hyun confronted Choi Yoon-seok alone. Yoon-seok didn't run. He didn't deny accessing the files. Instead, he told Tae-hyun that his wife had discovered information about the organization before she died. She had learned that someone close to Tae-hyun was secretly moving money through companies connected to the criminal network. She threatened to expose it. Yoon-seok admitted that he had confronted her that night, but he insisted he had not killed her. He claimed someone else arrived after their argument, someone higher in the organization, someone who wanted the evidence destroyed. Yoon-seok had helped cover up the truth because he believed it was the only way to protect himself. Tae-hyun stared at him with controlled fury. "You let me believe my wife died from illness." Yoon-seok lowered his eyes. "I was afraid." Tae-hyun stepped closer. "You let me bury her believing I had failed her." Yoon-seok said nothing. Then Tae-hyun asked the question that mattered most. "Who was there after you?" Yoon-seok finally gave him the name. The person who had ordered the cover-up had been a senior figure within the organization, someone who had benefited from Tae-hyun's grief and his isolation. But the name also explained why Jang Hyun-woo had known so much. Hyun-woo had been tracking the same person because the hidden financial network affected both organizations. Hyun-woo hadn't been trying to steal Zuri. He had been trying to force Tae-hyun to recognize that the threat was coming from inside his own circle. His ultimatum had been cruel, but it had also been designed to push Tae-hyun into investigating the people closest to him. Zuri had been caught in the middle because she had become the one person Tae-hyun could neither ignore nor easily replace. When Tae-hyun returned to Zuri, he didn't make excuses. He told her the truth. He told her that her credentials had been stolen, that she had been framed, and that someone had deliberately tried to destroy the trust between them. Zuri listened without interrupting. Then she asked him one question. "Do you believe me now?" Tae-hyun looked at her. "I should have believed you before." Zuri's expression softened, but she didn't immediately forgive him. "You were afraid." Tae-hyun nodded. "I was." She looked toward the children. "Then don't let fear make your decisions anymore." Tae-hyun took her hand. "I won't." For the first time, there was no suspicion between them, only relief. But the greatest revelation had come from the children themselves. Their memories had reopened a case everyone thought was closed. They had remembered the argument, the ring, the clinic, and the man their mother had feared. The children had been carrying pieces of the truth for 3 years without even understanding what those pieces meant. Eventually, the family returned to the mansion. It looked exactly the same from the outside, but inside everything had changed. The locked room was no longer a place of fear. Tae-hyun had finally opened it. Inside were photographs, letters, and belongings that had remained untouched since his wife's death. He didn't erase the past. He finally allowed himself to face it. And Zuri didn't try to replace the children's mother. She never had. What she had done was something different. She had given Min-jae, Seo-jun, and Ji-an permission to laugh again. She had taught them that remembering their mother didn't mean they had to live in fear forever. She had become part of their lives without demanding a title. One evening, weeks after the truth came out, Tae-hyun returned home earlier than usual. He entered the mansion quietly, just as he had done that night weeks before. But this time, he didn't hear silence. He heard laughter. He walked toward the kitchen and stopped at the doorway. Zuri was standing at the counter, preparing dinner. Flour dusted one side of her cheek. Min-jae was trying to stir something he had been explicitly told not to touch. Seo-jun was explaining a story at twice the speed anyone could understand. Ji, and was laughing so hard she could barely stand. Tae-hyun simply watched them. He remembered the man he had been before Zuri entered his life. A man who believed silence meant safety. A man who believed keeping people distant meant protecting them. A man who had mistaken grief for strength. Then Ji-an saw him. "Daddy?" She ran across the kitchen. Tae-hyun crouched and caught her. She hugged him tightly. Then she reached backward and grabbed Zuri's hand. She pulled both of them toward each other. Tae-hyun looked at Zuri. Zuri smiled. Ji-an looked at them both and said the words that finally explained the mystery from the night Tae-hyun had come home unannounced. "Now we're a family." Tae-hyun's eyes filled with emotion. He looked at Zuri, then took her hand. There was no need for another explanation. The house that had spent years remembering loss was finally making new memories, and that brings us back to where this story began. Midnight, Tae-hyun's unexpected return. The dark hallway, the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. 3 children covered in flour, Zuri standing among them, Ji-an running toward her, Tae-hyun frozen in the doorway, except now we understand why. The word that stopped him cold wasn't simply a nickname. It wasn't an innocent child's mistake. It represented everything that had changed inside that house. After 3 years of grief, the children had finally allowed themselves to love someone new without forgetting the mother they had lost. Zuri hadn't erased their past. She had helped them survive it. And Tae-hyun hadn't simply found a new caregiver for his children. He had found the person who reminded him that protecting a family doesn't mean keeping everyone at a distance. Sometimes it means having the courage to let someone in. Ji-an's voice still echoed through the kitchen. "Mommy." And this time, Tae-hyun didn't freeze. He smiled, because for the first time in 3 years, the word no longer sounded like a memory of what he had lost. It sounded like the beginning of what his family had found. And somewhere beyond the gates of the mansion, the final pieces of his wife's secret were still waiting to be uncovered. Because the truth about her death had finally been exposed, but the person who ordered the cover-up had not yet paid for what they had done. And that meant Tae-hyun's story was not over. Neither was Zuri's. Because the woman who entered his mansion as a maid had become the one person standing beside him when the truth finally came home.